Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Great and Noble Scheme, the tragic story of the expulsion of the French Acadians from their American homeland, by John Mack Faragher, narrated by Paul Heitsch. We are now upon a great and noble scheme of sending the neutral French out of this province, who have always been secret enemies and have encouraged our savages to cut our throats. If we effect their expulsion, it will be one of the greatest things that ever the English did in America, for by all accounts that part of the country they possess is as good land as any in the world. In case, therefore, we should get some good English farmers in their room, this province would abound with all kinds of provisions. Pennsylvania Gazette, 4 September 1755. Introduction. In the autumn of 1755, officers and troops from New England, acting under the authority of the colonial governors of Nova Scotia and Massachusetts, systematically rounded up more than 7,000 Acadians, the French-speaking Catholic inhabitants who lived in communities along the shores of the Bay of Fundy. Men, women, and children alike were crowded into transport vessels and deported in small groups to other British colonies. Many families were separated, some never to meet again. Another 10,000 to 12,000 Acadians managed to escape and spent years as refugees. Hundreds of them were captured and deported, while others took up arms in resistance. Meanwhile, their property was plundered, their communities were torched, their lands were seized. Le Grand Dérangement, the Acadian term for this great upheaval, continued until the end of the 7 Years' War between Great Britain and France in 1763. It claimed thousands of lives and laid waste one of the oldest colonial homelands in North America. After the war, the surviving Acadians settled again in the maritime region, but not on their former farms, for those had been turned over to Yankee settlers. Other Acadians sought refuge in the French colony of Louisiana, where they became the ancestors of today's Cajuns. Although their descendants now number several 100,000 persons in maritime Canada and southwestern Louisiana, most Americans are unfamiliar with the story of the Acadians. They are known, if known at all, as the unfortunate people of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's epic poem Evangeline. For Americans of a certain age, myself included, Longfellow was required reading in public school. His Acadians, however, were a literary creation, little more than victims who endured other men's prejudice, hatred, and greed. What about the Acadians of history? They were largely illiterate, leaving few documents of their own, so telling their story is a bit daunting. But their voices may be found in the colonial records of France and Great Britain. They turn out to be fascinating subjects in their own right. The founding generation of Acadians came from France in the early 17th century, contemporaries of the Puritan settlers of New England, to establish the French colony of l'Acadie. They developed a culture entirely their own, distinct not only from their Puritan neighbors to the southwest, but their neighbors to the northwest, the inhabitants of the St. Lawrence River Valley, known in early America as Canadians, today as French Canadians or Quebecois. Intermarrying with the native Mikmaq people of the region, the Acadians forged an ethnic accord that was exceptional in the colonial settlement of early North America. Adapting to their environment, they learned to dike and farm the tidal marshlands and perfected a farming system that was the envy of their neighbors. Living on the margins of the British and French empires, serving two masters, they declared themselves to be neutrals in the imperial contest. Neutrality was the Acadians' defining characteristic and their greatest asset. They pursued it for a century and prospered. Like authentic tragic heroes, they insisted on defining themselves in their own way, and in the end they were overtaken by catastrophe. The British government, and several generations of historians, defended their expulsion as a cruel necessity in the war against France. But the events of 1755 bear a striking similarity to more recent episodes of ethnic cleansing, the purposeful campaign of one ethnic or religious group to remove, by violent and terror-inspiring means, the civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from a certain geographic area. Reading in the history of colonial violence and warfare in 18th century North America, the campaign to remove the Acadians brought me up short. Was their expulsion an early example of ethnic cleansing? Was ethnic cleansing a part of America's founding history? This book grew out of these questions. As a historian of the American frontier, I have taught and written of the violent struggle between colonists and the indigenous inhabitants, as well as the bloody intercolonial conflicts that pitted English and French-speaking colonists against one another. The removal of the Acadians was something different. In the words of a British colonial correspondent in 1755, it was "a great and noble scheme, one of the greatest things that ever the English did in America." It was executed methodically by officers of the government in accordance with a carefully conceived plan many years in the making. It utilized all the available resources of the state. It included the seizure and destruction of Acadian records and registers, the arrest and isolation of community leaders, the separation of men from women and children. In the 19th century, operations of that kind would be directed at Indian peoples such as the Cherokees, but before 1755 nothing like it had been seen in North America. Today, the universal condemnation of ethnic cleansing by world opinion makes it difficult to defend what was done. In 2003, Queen Elizabeth II issued a royal proclamation acknowledging British responsibility for the decision to deport the Acadian people and regretting its tragic consequences. This is a tragic history. Tragic not only because the undeserved suffering of the Acadians was brought on by their pursuit of independence, but also because it tells of the destruction of common hopes and dreams. It requires listening not only to the voices of the French-speaking Catholic Acadians, but to the English-speaking Protestant Yankees who eventually removed them. It is a story of two peoples, of two paths, the ways they converged and diverged. It is premised on the conviction that American history is not exceptional, but universal. It is an attempt at recounting a history of Greater America, the wider relations and connections that went into the making of the United States. Chapter 1. L'Ordre du Bon Temps. The French arrival in l'Acadie, 1604 to 1616. The French colonization of l'Acadie began in earnest on 13 May 1606, when the Jonas, a vessel of 150 tons, loaded with provisions and carrying 40 men, weighed anchor at the port of La Rochelle and sailed for the infant outpost of Port Royal on the far side of the Atlantic. This was 7 months before the departure of English colonists for Jamestown in Virginia, and 14 years before the landing of the Mayflower at Plymouth Rock. In fact, by 1606 Frenchmen had been fishing in North American waters for decades, landing along the shore of the North Atlantic coast to dry their catch, and trading with the native hunters for furs, particularly beaver pelts, which could be fashioned into a waterproof material for coats and hats. But this expedition, under the command of Jean de Biencourt, Sieur de Poutrincourt, a 50-year-old aristocrat from the barony of Saint-Just in the region of Champagne, would establish the first French agricultural colony on the North Atlantic coast of North America. Sieur de Poutrincourt was the associate of Pierre de Gouin, Sieur de Mont, Viceroy and Captain General of New France, a vast swath of North America extending along the Atlantic coast from the 40th to the 46th degree of latitude, from Delaware Bay in the south to Newfoundland in the north. A veteran officer in the army of King Henri IV during the civil wars of religion fought between French Catholics and French Protestant Huguenots in the late 16th century, Dumont was described by one contemporary as a man of le cœur protégé aux autres, literally high-hearted, which was to say, of daring and adventurous disposition. Think of him as a French Sir Walter Raleigh. His royal appointment provided him a monopoly of the lucrative fur trade of northeastern North America, but, in turn, required him, in the name of the king, to people and cultivate the region, to plant towns and build fortifications, to establish, extend, and make known our name, power, and authority, and to subject, submit, and render obedient thereto all the tribes of this land, to summon and instruct them, provoke and rouse them to the knowledge of God and to the light of the Christian faith and religion, and to establish it among them. For Dumont, however, becoming the first of King Henri's subject in America, held no appeal. Like Raleigh, his interest lay less in settlement than in commerce, so the work of planting and converting he delegated to his associate Poutrincourt, who had lost much of his wealth during the religious wars and dreamed of recouping his fortune with the establishment of an agricultural colony. The idea was to transplant to the New World a version of the rural landscape of Champagne, a society of seigneurs et roturiers, lords who ruled the roost and commoners who worked the land. The start-up costs of this venture were to be supplied by the fur trade. There would be no subsidy from the royal treasury, which had been emptied by the religious wars. 2 years before, in 1604, Dumont and Poutrincourt, with a company of 75 men, had crossed the Atlantic on an exploratory mission, guided by the accomplished navigator Samuel du Champlain and the merchant trader Francis Gravé, Sieur du Pont, known as Pont Gravé, both of whom possessed substantial experience in American waters. At a secluded harbor the explorers christened Port Royal, now Annapolis Royal, Poutrincourt selected alluvial lands along a salubrious river for his colony. Leaving Dumont and the others to continue their exploration, in the summer of 1604 he sailed back to France in one of the expedition's vessels to make arrangements for bringing over colonists. The following spring, Sieur Dumont returned to France as well, his vessel loaded with a rich cargo of furs. He told Poutrincourt that he and the company had spent the previous summer successfully trading along the coast, and in the fall had established a base camp on an island at the mouth of the St. Croix River, today's boundary between the state of Maine and the province of New Brunswick. But the winter had been disastrous. 35 of the men, more than half the company, had perished from malnutrition and scurvy. In the spring, Dumont had relocated the operation to Port Royal, where he hoped the winters would prove milder. They were welcomed by several hundred Mikmaq residents of the area, who permitted Dumont to construct a permanent headquarters, a fort and habitation modeled after the fortified manor houses of the French countryside. Champlain, Pont Gravé, and some 24 men were still there, continuing to trade for furs and holding the site in anticipation of Poutrincourt's arrival with the colonists. Dumont would remain in France, in charge of the commercial operation. But for Poutrincourt, the American adventure had just begun. It was the crucial first step in his plan to establish his fortune and his lineage in America. Although the advance force traveling on the Jonas was composed entirely of men, women and children were to follow later once the colony was established. Poutrincourt had picked men from his own homeland, relatives and associates, including his 15-year-old son, Charles du Biencourt de Saint-Just, who was to perpetuate the family name in New France. His relative by marriage, Louis Hébert, a young apothecary with a deep interest in horticulture, who was to conduct experiments in the cultivation of grapes and grain, and to supervise the construction of the first winery and grist mill in North America, and his attorney, Marc Lescarbot, a 40-year-old Parisian bachelor assigned to act as the colony's notary and historian. When offered the position, Lescarbot later wrote in his engaging eyewitness account, Histoire de la Nouvelle-France, 1609, he jumped at the opportunity to exchange the tedious practice of the law for a chance to explore the New World with my own eyes. It is difficult to exaggerate the physical and psychological distance that separated the Old World from the New in the 17th and 18th centuries. The typical voyage took 6 or 7 weeks, but might last considerably longer depending on the season, the currents, the winds, and the fates. "I have been to Canada 7 times," one French captain of the era testified, "and I venture to state that the most favorable of those voyages gave me more white hairs than all those I have made elsewhere. It is a continual torment for mind and body." The voyage of the Jonas was to be Lescarbot's first crossing. It also proved to be his last, and he acknowledged his fear of traveling over the unstable sea, every moment within 2 fingers of death, à 2 doigts de la mort, as the saying goes. The voyage began pleasantly enough as the pilot steered the vessel into prevailing Atlantic currents, taking them southwest to the Azores, where he hoped to pick up the trade winds. But in the vicinity of those islands the weather turned foul. Gale-force westerlies bore down on the vessel, forcing the crew to close-haul the sails. Squalls rose up, muttering, snorting, whistling, howling, storming, rumbling, and violent seas tossed the vessel aloft upon mountains of water, and thence down, as it were, into the most profound depths of the world. Fighting their way across the Atlantic, the crew eventually caught the northward-coursing Gulf Stream, taking them into colder waters and impenetrable fogs. Finally, on 15 July, after more than 8 hard weeks at sea, the men sighted the coastline of North America. And while we held our course, lo, there came to us from the land odors of unrivaled sweetness, brought so abundantly by a warm breeze that all the Orient could not have produced more. They had reached another world. Despite the difficult voyage, the pilot had brought them directly to the harbor known as Conseau, from Comsoak, which in Mi'kmaq, the language of the Mi'kmaq people, means rocks on the other side, a reference to the cliffs of Cape Breton Island across the Channel, visible to those arriving by sea, whether by canoe or by sailing vessel. In the early 17th century, Conseau was the most important stopping place on the North Atlantic coast for hundreds of European fishing vessels from Portugal, the Biscayan harbors of Spain and France, ports in Brittany and Normandy, and England's Bristol Channel. They were drawn by the proximity to Le Grand Banc, the broad continental shelf extending offshore where the shallow waters teemed with so great multitudes of certain big fishes, as explorer Sebastian Cabot reported, that they sometimes stayed my ships. For a century, Europeans had been catching Atlantic cod here from spring to fall, salting them down and shipping them back to Europe. Salt cod had become a staple in the Mediterranean diet and, over the next century, would become a main provision of the slave plantations being established in the West Indies. European fishermen set up temporary fish-drying camps on the level beaches and were soon exchanging European goods for animal pelts with the Mikmaq, the plural form of Mi'kmaq. This was the beginning of the North American fur trade. There was intense rivalry among fishermen, yet for the next 50 years the fishery remained open to all comers, and men from scores of ethnic backgrounds mingled amicably at places such as Conseau. As for those who trucked and bartered with the natives of the country, however, it was precisely Sieur Dumont's intention to curtail their commerce, or rather to require them to direct it through his operation at Port Royal. During his initial exploration in 1604, Dumont arrested a trader on the coast south of Conseau, confiscating his goods as well as his vessel. But there were dozens more like him, and Dumont was now back in France, a long way from these shores. The lands south of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, territory that today includes the Canadian provinces of Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, as well as the state of Maine, Lescarbot and Poutrincourt knew as l'Acadie. There are 2 accounts of the name's origins. In 1524, the Tuscan explorer Giovanni de Verrazzano, sailing for the French crown, was so impressed by the beauty of the North American coast that he christened it Acadia, after a prose pastorelle of the same name published in 1502, a work that popularized the notion of a rural golden age among the ancients. On 16th-century French maps and charts, l'Acadie appeared as the place name for the northern Atlantic coastal region, and it was the name known and used by French sea captains and fishermen. According to this explanation, l'Acadie was simply a corruption of l'Arcadie. An alternate account notes the similarity in pronunciation between Acadie and the Mi'kmaq suffix Acadie, meaning place of abundance, commonly used by the Mikmaq to mark important resource sites, as in Shenectady, place of abundant cranberries, or Shubenacadie, place of abundant wild potatoes. These explanations are most compelling in combination, l'Arcadie mutating into l'Acadie as a result of the intercultural conversations between Mi'kmaq hunters and French traders. Intercultural conversation was something about which Lescarbot was to learn a good deal. As he stood on the deck of the Jonas, gazing toward the welcoming shore of Canseau, he saw two Basque longboats rapidly approaching the vessel. The Basques had been among the first Europeans to exploit these waters, although, like other fishermen, they rarely established permanent residence in North America, but remained seasonal visitors. The first boat was manned by fishermen from the French port of Saint-Malo, the other by several Mi'kmaq seamen who had a moose painted on their sail. By the early 17th century, the natives of the Atlantic coast had mastered the art of sailing small European craft. They reached the vessel first and climbed aboard. These natives were the first I had ever seen, Lescarbot wrote, and I admired their fine shape and well-formed faces. The French called them sauvages, a term that did not have the same hard edge as the English savage, yet was meant as a marker for the supposed primitivism of native culture compared to the sophistication of Europeans. Lescarbot employed the term, but with some skepticism. We commonly call them sauvages, but they are anything but that. The leader of this group, for example, wore only a piece of coarse red frieze with matachias, beadwork, around his neck and wrists, above his elbows and at his waist. Yet the Basque boat, the red cloth, even the tools used by the native craftsmen to manufacture the wampum were all imported from Europe, and were evidence not of difference, but of the connections between the continents. Using signs and a trade jargon including many French and Basque words, indeed, they have been so long frequented by the Basques, Lescarbot joked, that the language of the coast tribes is half Basque. The Mi'kmaq captain told Poutrincourt what had taken place at Port Royal over the past winter. Another dozen Frenchmen, close to half the remaining company, had died of scurvy. The men were understandably desperate for the arrival of the supply vessel, and when it failed to appear by early summer, they feared being abandoned. Champlain and Pont-Gravé had ordered the construction of a small vessel in which they planned to sail to Canseau, hoping to catch a ride back to France with a fishing vessel. They might already have left Port Royal. The Jonas departed from Canseau the next morning, encountering more dense fog as it coasted southward. Rounding Cape Sable, the vessel sailed into Baie Française, the large body of water separating the Acadian peninsula from the mainland. At the end of the century, on the eve of the Anglo-American conquest of l'Acadie, New Englanders would rename it Bay of Fundy, perhaps from the Portuguese Baía Funda, or Deep Bay. Indeed, it is exceptionally deep, not only in fathoms but in nautical miles, a narrowing funnel that pushes and squeezes incoming tides to ever-increasing heights, reaching a maximum of 50 feet or more in the basins at the head of the bay, the greatest tidal variation in the world. As the crew of the Jonas soon discovered, the powerful surge of water creates dangerously strong currents that threaten to dash the vessel against what Lescarbot described as the high, rocky, and precipitous shore. On the evening of 26 July, the Jonas came to the entrance of Port Royal Harbor, a narrow portal in the cliff wall. But so strong was the ebb of the tide through the gut that the vessel could not enter, and the crew had to cast anchor in the rough waters along the rocky coast. After passing an anxious night, late the next morning they entered with the flood tide, though not without much difficulty, wrote Lescarbot, for the wind was contrary, and gusts blew from the mountains which were like to carry us on the rocks. Amid all this, our ship sailed stern first, and more than once turned round, without it being possible to prevent it. Reaching the calm waters of the basin, however, the captain quickly regained control, and for the first time Lescarbot gazed out at the site of the new colony. He was charmed. This Port Royal, the home of Sieur de Poutrincourt, is the most beautiful earthly habitation that God has ever made, he would later write. It is fortified upon the north by a range of 12 or 15 leagues of mountains, upon which the sun beats all day, and by hills on the southern or meridian shore, which forms a port that can securely harbor 20,000 ships. Beautiful meadows at the mouth of what the French called Rivière Dauphin offered grass for grazing livestock, making it a perfect place to establish a settlement. But what most impressed Lescarbot was the extent to which the site remained wilderness. What a waste of resources, he thought, seeing that so many folk are ill off in this world who could make their profit of this land if they only had a leader to bring them thither. With Poutrincourt's guidance, Port Royal could be the beginning of great things, truly a new France. As the Jonas sailed up the harbor toward the river mouth, Lescarbot's reveries were interrupted by the sighting, to the larboard, of the French fort and habitation at the verge of forest and bay. It appeared abandoned. When the vessel drifted near to shore, Lescarbot saw a native man and woman suddenly emerge from the woods and run toward the building. The man cried out like a madman, although no one on board could understand his words. The two then jumped into a birch-bark canoe and began paddling swiftly toward the Jonas. Startled, the crew sprang to, but as the canoe drew closer, the pair signaled their friendly intentions. They pulled alongside, and the young woman steadied the craft while the man climbed aboard. It was Membertou, sagamore, or leader, of the several hundred Mikmaq who regularly summered at Port Royal. He greeted Poutrincourt and, using signs and broken French, explained that Champlain and Pont-Gravé had sailed away with most of the men a few days before, leaving only 2 soldiers behind to hold the post. The 2 men had been napping when Membertou came running, shouting orders at them, "Do you not see a great ship which is arriving, and we do not know who they are?" It certainly seemed that Membertou had assumed authority over these men. Champlain later told Poutrincourt that when he and Pont-Gravé left, Membertou agreed to look after them as if they were his own children. Finishing his explanation, Membertou signaled to shore. One of the Frenchmen cautiously emerged from the gate with a lighted matchlock, and the other poked up from the parapet, where a small cannon was positioned. Now recognizing the French ensign flying from the Jonas, he let loose a welcoming cannonade, and the crew saluted back with 3 rounds from their own guns and a blast from the vessel's trumpet. Soon we landed, wrote Lescarbot, visited the house, and passed the day in returning thanks to God, in inspecting the wigwams of the sauvages, and in wandering through the meadows. Most histories of the Frenchman's subsequent year at Port Royal failed to pay much attention to the Mikmaq village, which Lescarbot described as a town surrounded with high palisades, with dozens of large conical wigwams, from the Mi'kmaq Wisimp Wigwam, dwelling, as well as several impressive lodges, one as big as a market hall, where the community held their public gatherings and feasts. The village was a busy place, with women gossiping, children playing, and dogs everywhere underfoot. In the standard historical accounts, the Mikmaq appear fleetingly as occasional visitors to what Poutrincourt called his manor house. In fact, it was the French who were the visitors. The French built their outpost near Membertou's village, and they remained at the pleasure of the chief and his people. "I am the sagamore of this country," Membertou declared at a ceremony of welcome held shortly after the Jonas arrived, and in the tradition of chiefs he graciously extended hospitality to the Normans, the name the Mikmaq used for the French, reflecting the fact that the first Frenchmen in the area hailed from Normandy. Membertou and Poutrincourt exchanged gifts. The French presented an assortment of trade goods, capes and jackets, kettles, hatchets, and knives, and the chief in turn declared that since the French held metals in high regard, and since Sagamores must be honorable and liberal toward the other, he wished to grant the French king the right to mine at a place on the upper bay which Champlain had.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?